Bedford, late autumn 1939. The wind cut through the old Nissen huts that had been hurriedly converted into workshops. Inside, beneath the pale light of a single lamp, a small group of men worked in silence. Their breath hung in the air. On a wooden bench, an unassuming engineer, shirt sleeves rolled, spectacles fogged, held a lump of steel in one hand, a magnet in the other. The object snapped together with a dull click, clinging with surprising force. Around him, the air smelled faintly of oil and paraffin. Sheets of notes, pencil drawings, and fragments of metal littered the bench. This was no grand laboratory. No uniformed officers stood over him. Just a quiet man testing an idea. A weapon that could grip the hull of a ship and wait. In London, the Admiralty spoke of convoys and losses. In Bedford, one man spoke of magnets in mines. Within months, his crazy little invention would become one of the most feared tools of the war. Sinking ships not in open battle, but silently in the dark water beneath the enemy's harbours. Britain, 1939. The nation stood on the brink once more. The lines of war had been drawn, though the fighting had yet to fully unfold. Britain's coastlines braced for an assault unseen since Napoleon's age. Yet the new threat did not come from soldiers or tanks. It came from beneath the sea. In the winter of 1939, a new German weapon appeared in British waters. Merchant ships began to vanish without warning, their hulls shattered in calm seas, their crews taken by surprise. These were not torpedo strikes. They were magnetic mines, a terrifying innovation deployed by the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine. Dropped from aircraft into estuaries and shipping lanes, the mines rested on the seabed, triggered by the magnetic field of passing steel hulls. The Royal Navy was unprepared. Minesweeping trawlers scoured the Thames and Humber with outdated gear designed for contact mines. The scale of the crisis soon became clear. By December 1939, shipping losses were mounting and harbours from Harwich to Sheerness were paralyzed. The Admiralty feared the country's trade lifelines might choke before spring. It was then that Lieutenant Commander John Ouvry of HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's mine and torpedo school, volunteered to recover one of these new weapons. On 23 November 1939, in the shallow waters of Shoeburyness, Ouvry approached a half-buried mine that could detonate at the slightest disturbance. Kneeling in cold mud, he removed its firing mechanism piece by piece. Inside, he found a magnetic trigger, the first of its kind seen by British eyes. The discovery confirmed what naval scientists suspected. Germany had harnessed magnetism to wage invisible war. Within days, the Admiralty ordered an emergency program to counter it. Deperming, degaussing, and new magnetic sweeps were rushed into service. Scientists from Woolwich Arsenal and universities across the country joined naval engineers to find ways to shield ships and neutralize mines. The immediate danger began to ebb, but the lesson lingered. If magnetism could be used to destroy, could it also be used to defend? Or even to attack? In London, the Ministry of Supply received a proposal from a small and rather unusual department, Military Intelligence Research, known as MIR. Their mission was to devise unorthodox weapons, portable, ingenious, and disruptive. Within weeks, their efforts merged into a new experimental unit under the War Office, MD1, later nicknamed Churchill's Toyshop. It operated from a quiet country house near Aylesbury and later at Whitchurch, producing ideas that seemed fanciful, even absurd. Among its early collaborators was Stuart Macrae, editor of Armchair Science, a civilian engineer with a sharp mind and little patience for bureaucracy. Working with Major Millis Jefferis of the Royal Engineers, he began experimenting with magnetic adhesion, how a shaped charge could cling to the steel of a ship's hull long enough to deliver its payload. The challenge was formidable. Seawater corroded ordinary magnets. Surfaces were curved, oily, and unpredictable. A device had to be strong enough to grip underwater, yet small enough for a diver or commando to carry discreetly. Time fuses had to be both precise and reliable, often improvised from civilian materials, clockworks, acid capsules, and the occasional sweet casing. Macrae's breakthrough came in the form of a simple idea, a concave steel dish fitted with permanent magnets arranged around its rim. When pressed against a ship's hull, it would cling with remarkable strength. At its core sat a small but concentrated explosive charge, just enough to tear through plating below the waterline. The shape gave it a nickname, the Limpet mine. At first, the Admiralty dismissed it as impractical. The concept of a man swimming beneath a ship in enemy waters seemed far-fetched. Yet Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, took an interest. He had long believed that unconventional ideas, when driven by courage, could yield decisive results. His support ensured MD1's survival and the Limpet mine's future. By early 1940, prototypes were being tested at Farnham and the Admiralty Experimental Station at Portsmouth. Engineers recorded the adhesion strength, the resistance to pressure, and the time delays of various fuses. The results astonished even the skeptics. Once attached, the magnetized bowl could not be pried off by hand. Quietly, the War Office authorized limited production. The Limpet was never intended for grand naval engagements. Its power lay in stealth and sabotage, in the unseen battles that would shape the war's hidden front. In a war of factories and fleets, Britain had discovered a weapon that could be carried by one man and change the balance beneath the waves. The stage was set, not in the skies of Britain or the trenches of Europe, but in the dark harbors of occupied Europe, where men and magnets would soon wage their silent war. By 1941, the shape of the war had changed. France had fallen, and the coast of Europe had become a fortress stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Bay of Biscay. German shipping moved through occupied harbors with growing confidence. Bordeaux, St. Nazaire, Rotterdam, Oslo. The Kriegsmarine relied on these ports to maintain U-boats, supply convoys, and move raw materials from Scandinavia and the colonies. Britain, battered but unbroken, sought ways to strike back. The Royal Air Force turned increasingly to an unorthodox mission: aerial mine-laying, codenamed gardening. From the spring of 1940 onwards, squadrons of Hamptons, Wellingtons, and later Lancasters flew by night, dropping magnetic mines into the narrow channels of the Baltic, the Elbe, and the approaches to German harbors. The idea was simple: deny the enemy the freedom of his own waters. Each garden was given a code name: nasturtium, rosemary, and spinach. The crews knew them well. A single magnetic mine properly placed could sink or disable a ship for months. By late 1940, the Admiralty's records listed dozens of confirmed sinkings and many more probables. The strategy was subtle, relentless, and profoundly British, the patient art of quiet disruption. Yet aerial mine-laying, for all its success, was imprecise. Mines could drift or lie undisturbed for weeks. What was needed was something more deliberate: hands-on sabotage, a way to strike directly at a ship in harbor. This was the moment when the small, hand-held Limpet mine began to find its purpose. While RAF aircraft laid their gardens from the sky, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and Royal Navy commandos began experimenting with clandestine attacks by sea. The logic was simple: if a magnetic device could adhere to steel underwater, it could be carried by a diver, canoe, or small craft. A few pounds of high explosive, properly placed, could cripple a vessel as effectively as any torpedo. Training began quietly at Loch Erisort and later at Fort William, under the supervision of Combined Operations. The early tests were brutal. Divers had to work by touch in icy blackness, finding the curved hulls of moored targets, then groping for the correct depth, usually around 2 meters below the waterline. The mine had to be armed, attached, and left with its fuse ticking before the tide turned. Mistakes were fatal. The engineering behind these devices reflected the best of British pragmatism. Each Limpet was fitted with segmental magnets that conformed to a ship's curved plating. The casing was strong but simple, pressed from steel or aluminium alloy. A waterproof fuse mechanism, often using a chemical time delay, the famous time pencil, allowed the saboteur to escape long before detonation. It was small enough to carry under a coat or in a satchel. The Royal Engineers produced variants for different missions. The clam, a smaller version, could be attached to vehicles, trains, or bridge supports. For riverine sabotage, the W-bomb offered a more powerful charge that could be thrown or placed against barges. Each design bore the hallmarks of British field ingenuity: compact, reliable, and quietly lethal. As 1942 approached, these devices found their way into the hands of those who would use them most daringly: the men of Combined Operations, the Royal Navy's charioteers, and the commandos of the SOE. Their task was not to fight pitched battles, but to unpick the machinery of German logistics, one hull at a time. In the occupied ports of France and Norway, rumors spread of ships vanishing overnight, of explosions in calm harbours. The Germans spoke of sabotage, of British frogmen. Few knew the truth, that behind these operations lay the vision of one engineer and the curious force of a magnet's pull. By the summer of 1942, the Limpet mine had evolved from an eccentric experiment in a Bedford workshop into one of the most effective and versatile weapons of covert warfare. It could be carried in a rucksack, strapped to a canoe, or lowered from a pier. It required no power source, no complex mechanism, only courage and precision. In a war of mass production, the Limpet was intensely personal. Each one placed by hand, each explosion a solitary act of defiance. The stage was now set for its true test, when British commandos and SOE agents would bring the weapon to the enemy's doorstep, and the quiet magnetic bowl would begin its campaign beneath the occupied seas of Europe. The Limpet began, as many of Britain's best ideas did, at a workbench rather than a war table. Here sat civilians and soldiers together, editors, engineers, royal engineers, and a handful of unconventional officers. Stuart Macrae, Major Millis Jefferis, and Cecil Van de Peer Clark are names that appear in memoirs and files. What mattered more was the temperament they shared, impatience with accepted limits, a steady curiosity and a willingness to make things that ought not to work nonetheless. In the dim light of MD1's workshops, experiment followed. Experiment. A civilian who spent his days editing popular science brought a practical problem-solving habit honed on a different stage. A royal engineer brought tolerances, testing protocols, and a sense of what would survive a soldier's hands. They argued over magnet alloys and casing thickness. They tested fuses in pouring rain and at dawn on a borrowed jetty. Failures were treated as lessons, not embarrassments. This fusion of minds was peculiarly British. It drew on a reserve of craftsmanship, the apprentice's eye for a seam, the machinist's sense for balance, and married it to military urgency. Men who had never met before would work long into the night, their language practical. How much will that cling? What will it weigh underwater? The answers were found empirically with candlelight and calipers, not committee papers. There was also quiet leadership. Churchill's interest in MD1 and the War Office's tolerance for eccentric projects created a space where ingenuity could be pursued without the usual red tape. That trust, coupled with the stubbornness of these men, converted a lone idea about magnets into a weapon that could be carried in a satchel and activated by a hand in the dark. At first glance, the Limpet is astonishingly simple. A shallow steel bowl, magnets set around its rim, and a charge at its center. The elegance is deceptive. Behind that simplicity lay months of metallurgical trials, hydrodynamic tinkering, and fuse engineering. Permanent magnets in 1940 were not the polished, corrosion-resistant components we expect today. They corroded. They lost strength under pressure. Their hold varied with the curvature and coating of a hull. The solution was pragmatic. Segmental magnets arranged to conform to curved plate. When pressed to a hull, the segments distributed the load, increasing contact area and adhesion. The concave dish shape concentrated the pull. Even a rusted, oily surface offered enough contact for the device to bite. Waterproofing was another battlefield. Salt water is merciless. Casings were pressed and brazed. Gaskets were tested under simulated tides, fuses sealed against seepage. The time pencil and a small chemical delay device became an icon of these designs. Reliable, compact, and passive, it allowed the saboteur an assured window to escape. Alternate fusing methods were trialed: clockwork, acid drip delays, and small percussion triggers, all with the same aim: reliability in hostile conditions. Explosive selection was sober and precise. The charge needed to breach plating below the waterline, yet be small enough to be portable and to limit secondary hazards to surrounding structures. Shaped charges were unnecessary. A concentrated block of high explosive placed at the point of maximum structural weakness would do the work. Testing measured bubble formation, pressure waves, and the way a single, well-placed hole could flood a compartment, rendering a vessel useless without complete destruction. The result was a tool that owed its success to restraint as much as invention. Modest power, exceptional adhesion, and fuses that required no batteries or external signals. It was technology paired to the necessities of clandestine warfare. The Limpet's power lay not only in its engineering, but in the tactics that delivered it. The weapon demanded a quiet insertion doctrine, an art of approach, placement, and escape. Training took place in cold locks and tidal estuaries. Men learned to navigate by sound and feel, not sight. Canoes and collapsible full boats carried saboteurs and their kits close to a target's shadow. Swimmers, wiped with grease and rubber, learned to read a ship's mooring lines and fender profiles by touch. Timing was everything. The turn of a tide could make the difference between a successful placement and discovery by a passing sentinel. Routes were planned with the same painstaking care as a naval operation. Reconnaissance parties noted patrolling patterns, searchlight arcs, and the rhythm of harbor traffic. Small teams would shadow a ship's routine for nights, learning when tugs arrived, when cargo shifted, and when watch rotations thinned. The ability to attach the mine 2 meters below the waterline, beneath conspicuous activity, relied on this quiet intelligence. Escape plans were equally pragmatic. Exfiltration might be a slow paddle into fog, a submerged swim to a prearranged dinghy, or blending ashore in the dark among dock workers. Sometimes a device was placed from a small motor launch under the guise of fishermen, at other times by stealthy swimmers clearing a path through nets and booms. This was sabotage choreographed as a small-scale ballet, disciplined, rehearsed, and dependent on human skill as much as mechanical cunning. Each successful placement reduced enemy tonnage without risking fleet action. Each failure taught a new rule of the dark craft. The angles above reveal how a single idea threaded through human character, practical technology, and precise tactics. The Limpet did not prosper simply because engineers were clever. It prospered because a particular culture of British wartime leadership allowed eccentricity to survive. Winston Churchill, insistent, impatient, and fascinated by invention, created institutional space for what otherwise might have been dismissed as impractical tinkering. MD1, tucked away from the normal supply chain and shielded from the slow machinery of procurement, owed its existence to that patronage. This was a wartime bargain. Senior leaders would tolerate risk and small-scale eccentricity in return for results that conventional forces could not obtain. The War Office and Admiralty, stretched thin by larger demands, were pragmatic. They accepted prototypes that failed in the laboratory, if the same prototypes might succeed in the field where imagination mattered. That tolerance was purposeful. Britain's strategy during the darkest years of 1940-42 was not to match German industry in volume, but to multiply the effect of limited resources through ingenuity. Policy decisions reflected this balance. Resources allocated to MD1 and combined operations remained modest, yet the units were given operational autonomy, a rare commodity in bureaucratic systems. Churchill's willingness to intervene personally in matters that captured his imagination mattered less for its theatricality than for its consequence. Funding, protection from cancellation, and the ability to field test ideas rapidly. In effect, Limpet development became a study in distributed leadership, small teams empowered, quick to iterate, and accountable for direct results. The leadership angle also extended to how targets were authorized. Sabotage in neutral or civilian-heavy harbors posed political risks. Ministers and service chiefs weighed these risks without melodrama. Orders that permitted Limpet operations were measured, not reckless. They were the product of sober calculation. If a modest, covert strike saved escort vessels and merchant tonnage, then the strategic gain justified the local danger. This steady, risk-aware patronage allowed a crazy magnet trick to move from bench to brine, with official blessing. No mechanical device can operate effectively without intelligence to guide it. The Limpet's effectiveness depended on reconnaissance, quietly, precisely, and often at risk. Photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft were studied not just for ship positions, but for the details that mattered to a diver: the height of fenders, the presence of booms, the spacing of mooring lines. Naval intelligence compiled timetables of tug movements, cargo handling routines, and the rotation of night watches. From these small facts came actionable windows. Deception played its part. Successful sabotage required that damage look like mischance where possible. That reduced reprisals and complicated enemy forensics. Explosions that could be plausibly attributed to a drifting mine or a gas explosion were tactically preferred to strikes that bled a clear signature of organized sabotage. When this was not possible, forgery and false paperwork sometimes complemented physical attacks. A bogus fishing launch, the right flags, or a plausible civilian profile could move a team through a checkpoint without inspection. Signals intelligence fed into this picture. The pace and content of wireless traffic, gleaned from Bletchley Park's decrypts where available to operational planners, added strategic context. Where convoys passed, where repair slots were scarce, and which ports were most valuable to disrupt. This blend of human reconnaissance, aerial photography, and signals intelligence converted the Limpet from a curious device into a weapon deployed with surgical intent. The result was a form of maritime tradecraft. Saboteurs were not merely craftsmen of explosives, they were analysts of movement and mood. Their planning read like a small-scale campaign. Identify the target, time the insertion to a lull, attach the device where it would disable, and leave an explanation plausible enough to muddy the enemy's response. In this way, intelligence and deception amplified a single device's impact across the wider theater. Sabotage, by its nature, sits in a difficult moral place. It targets infrastructure, often placed where workers, small traders, and dockside families live and work. The Limpet mine, though designed to limit collateral damage by disabling hulls rather than wrecking whole quays, nonetheless posed ethical questions that British planners faced with a clear-eyed pragmatism. Operational orders attempted to minimize civilian harm. Targets were chosen for their military value. Harbor facilities essential to U-boat operations or to war logistics were prioritized. Teams were trained to place charges where damage would render a vessel unserviceable, but not create a conflagration that might spread to adjacent warehouses or fuel stores. In practice, these distinctions were never exact. Explosions could ignite cargo, or secondary damage could ripple to the dockside community. Each raid therefore carried weighty human consequences. Commanders and ministers balanced these costs against the larger moral imperative of protecting Britain and its allies. In a conflict where the enemy's strategy targeted civilian populations, directly the Blitz and U-boat attacks against convoys, clandestine strikes on enemy supply lines were seen as a proportionate military measure. Yet this did not excuse complacency. Reports and after-action reviews frequently examined civilian injury as a failure in planning, as much as a tragic outcome. Where mistakes occurred, they were recorded and learned from. This cautious moral calculus reflected a broader British wartime ethic, resolve tempered by restraint. The Limpet mine became an instrument of that ethic, a way to inflict military harm while striving to limit unnecessary suffering. It was a small, grim reminder that engineering and morality must often be weighed together in wartime decisions. The angles close on a single point: a modest device, shaped by leadership, informed by intelligence, and judged by conscience, could alter the maritime balance. December 1942, a moonless night over the Bay of Biscay. The sea breathed cold and flat. A handful of wooden cockle shells, collapsible canoes, rode low, invisible on the black water. Inside them were men whose faces the world would later call the cockleshell heroes. Their orders were precise: slip past the outer defenses, creep into Bordeaux Harbor, and place charges beneath the keels of enemy ships that serviced U-boats and raiders. The operation had been shaped by months in workshops and locks. The device they carried was small and brutal in its clarity: a steel bowl fitted with segmental permanent magnets, a compact charge at its center, and a time pencil that would count down in hours. It could be strapped to a thigh, tucked into a canoe, or carried in a webbing pouch. To place it, a man had only to feel for the hull, press the bowl to the plated curve, and let the magnets find their grip. At 02:20 on the appointed night, Major Herbert Blondie Hasler and his team landed their canoes under the shadow of harbor lights. They moved by touch. Moorings and quaysides rose around them like dark cliffs. One by one, they lashed their limpets beneath the waterline, 2 meters down where the steel was thinnest and a single hole could flood a compartment. The fuses ticked away. The men slipped away into the mist toward an uncertain overland crossing. The explosions came like distant thunder. The crewmen ashore first heard the rip and wrenching of metal, then the splash as cargo shifted and the harbor alarm lit up. Several vessels were disabled. Others took on water and lay low in the quay. The toll was tactical rather than theatrical. No dramatic sinkings in open sea, but ships out of service for weeks, repair berths booked solid, and German logistics forced to reroute. One small raid had multiplied the strain across a theater where docking capacity was finite. The human cost was stark. Of the 10 men who set out, only 2, Bill Sparks among them, returned to Britain. The rest were captured, killed, or lost. Yet the operation impressed a wider truth upon London. A modest device, carried and placed by a handful of men, could inflict strategic disruption out of proportion to its size. If Frankton was daring, the campaign against the Tirpitz brought the Limpet into direct conversation with capital ships. By September 1943, the German battleship lay sheltered in the frozen fjords of northern Norway. Surface attack was impossible, air attack expensive and uncertain. The Admiralty turned to a different tool, X-class midget submarines, tiny craft that carried 2 divers and a limp. Deliberate charge intended to be placed directly beneath a ship's hull. Operation Source began in the long Arctic twilight. On 22 September, a flotilla of X-craft slipped into Kafjord. Their crews navigated minefields and patrols, then closed on the Tirpitz. Divers exited their cramped boats, swam beneath the monster's keel, and fixed enormous charges, essentially scaled-up limpets, to the battleship's hull. The charges were larger, the danger multiplied by the scale of the target, but the principle remained the same: adhesion, placement, and a timed escape. At dawn, explosions shattered the fjord's silence. The Tirpitz did not sink that day, but she lay grievously damaged out of action for months. The strategic consequence was immediate. Naval planners in Berlin faced a sudden acute shortage of available capital ships in the North Atlantic theater. Escort allocations shifted. U-boat operations recalibrated. A targeted attack executed by a handful of men with magnetic charges had diverted enemy resources on an industrial scale between these extremes. The canoes in Bordeaux and the midget submarines in Kafjord lay a host of other operations that tested the Limpet's limits. In the Mediterranean and along the Norwegian coast, Royal Navy divers and combined operations teams mounted raids on dry docks, oil storage, and transport barges. Human torpedoes and chariot boats carried frogmen into harbors at night. In riverine theaters, small W-bombs and clam devices were affixed to barges and bridges. Each mission adapted the same core lesson: small, well-placed damage can translate into strategic friction for an enemy that depends on movement, repair, and throughput. What made these operations decisive was not merely the explosives, but the union of innovation and execution. The Limpet was only as good as the reconnaissance that found the weak point. It was only as useful as the policy that authorized the raid. It was only as strategic as the intelligence that selected high-value targets. In each successful case, time pencils had to be set, currents accounted for, watch rotations observed, and escape routes rehearsed. Failures were instructive. Probes that discovered new patterns of security informed later raids. The craft of sabotage became iterative and professional. There were also unintended consequences. The visible success of magnetic charges taught the enemy to guard differently. More patrols, new booms, improved hull maintenance, and accelerated degaussing. German engineers experimented with countermeasures. Port defenses hardened. The Limpet had altered the calculus of maritime security, and the enemy adapted, exactly the pattern British planners had forecast. By the close of 1943, the Limpet and its kin had moved from curiosity to accepted tool. The climax of this evolution was not a single explosion but a pattern of results. Harbors harried, repair yards clogged, capital ships delayed, all through a catalog of small, precise attacks. The greatest turning point came when the Admiralty, the SOE, and combined operations accepted the Limpet as an instrument of state policy, a weapon to be used, with care, in the broader struggle of supply and denial. The results of these operations were not measured only in explosions. They were measured in days of dockyard time, in the diversion of repair ships, and in the sudden scarcity of berths for damaged tonnage. Each damaged hull required a slot, a team of welders, and a chain of tugs and pontoons that could not be used elsewhere. The Limpet's true power was to turn the enemy's logistical calculus against them. Consider the literal map of Western Europe in 1942-43. Ports, such as Bordeaux and Saint-Nazaire, were not merely anchorages. They were hubs of repair, resupply, and refit. The loss of a single berth could ripple across an entire theater. After the Frankton raid, the canoe attack on Bordeaux in December 1942, German repair resources were stretched thin. Ships that might otherwise have returned to Atlantic patrols were laid up for weeks. Convoy timetables tightened. Escort allocations shifted. These were not easily reversible costs. Operation Source against the Tirpitz amplified the lesson on a grander scale. The Tirpitz was a strategic linchpin for the Kriegsmarine's posture in the North Atlantic, an object of disproportionate concern for British naval planners. On 22 September 1943, the X-class submarines that penetrated Kafjord carried charges based on the same adhesion principles that governed Limpets. Divers affixed these scaled charges beneath the battleship's hull. The explosions, the precise corrosive violence of underwater detonation, did not send the Tirpitz to the bottom, but they inflicted critical damage. She was rendered unfit for operations for a prolonged period, effectively neutralized as a threat in the short term. For the Allied navies, that removal from active deployment changed the allocation of capital ships and convoy escorts across the Northern Theater. Between these headline operations and the less celebrated night raids lay a steady attrition campaign. Mines and limpets combined to force the Kriegsmarine to adapt. German engineers and dock authorities instituted additional anti-sabotage measures, improved boom nets, more thorough hull inspections, and increased patrols by harbor craft. Degaussing and better hull maintenance reduced the efficacy of purely aerial magnetic mines, but they could not eliminate the vulnerability posed by man-placed charges. Small teams could still exploit the human gaps in guarding long stretches of coastline and the sprawling complexity of busy ports. Quantitatively, the effect was cumulative and hard to summarize in a single statistic. The Limpet was rarely responsible for the instantaneous destruction of a capital ship. Its strategic return came in the form of time denied. Admiralty summaries from the period record repeated instances where a single night raid produced a backlog of repairs that lasted for weeks. Across months, those delays added to losses in convoy coverage and to missed patrol windows for U-boats, an operational friction that weighed heavily on German maritime logistics. There were also psychological consequences. Harbor managers began to distrust the assumption that docks were safe. Crews slept poorly. Shore workers feared unexplained blasts and began to insist on tighter security. The cumulative effect was to slow operations. Cargo took longer to move. Tugs were diverted for protective duties, and the cost of maintaining a port increased. For an enemy already spread thin across multiple fronts, this psychological attrition was valuable. The Limpet's legacy in practice was therefore twofold: tactical denial and strategic distortion. Tactically, it made key ships temporarily unusable. Strategically, it forced the Germans to expend scarce labor, dock capacity, and resources on defensive repair rather than on offensive deployments. Small-scale actions multiplied into theater-wide consequences. Yet these gains came at a price and with limits. The human cost of raids was high. Men who trained in locks and estuaries faced capture, torture, and execution if taken in uniform behind enemy lines. The Frankton raiders suffered grievously. The X-craft crews endured claustrophobic danger. Planners weighed the value of each mission against the likely loss of irreplaceable personnel. That calculus was not abstract. It was a sober ledger kept behind closed doors. Finally, the Limpet forced doctrinal change. The Admiralty and combined operations incorporated the techniques and lessons into broader strategy. Limpet-style charges were adopted for sabotage against inland watercraft and river barges. The design evolved. Different sizes, fuses tuned for specific tidal conditions, and delivery methods ranging from diver-placed devices to clandestine attachment by small motor launches. What began as a crazy magnet trick in a Bedford workshop had become an established method of warfare: small, precise, and strategically potent. By late 1943, the pattern was clear. The enemy adapted. So did the British. The Limpet had not ended the naval war, but it had shifted a part of it irrevocably. It proved that asymmetry, the focused application of a modest technology by skilled hands, could create leverage against a numerically superior foe. That intellectual pivot, from mass confrontation to targeted denial, marks the Limpet's decisive turning point in the maritime campaign. the story did not end with the last explosion. It continued in dockyard reports and Admiralty dispatches, and in the quiet pages of men's service records. Those documents would later form the ledger by which historians measured the device's contribution, not solely in tonnage sunk, but in the time saved for Allied convoys, the resources denied to the enemy, and the courage demanded of those who placed it. The Limpet's work reshaped harbors, fleets, and priorities. Its next chapter is in the measurable aftermath, the strain on German logistics, the toll on men, and the institutional echoes left in post-war maritime defense. When the noise of war finally receded, the quiet legacy of the Limpet mine could be read not in monuments or medals, but in the statistics of repair, production, and survival. The Admiralty's post-war summaries reveal a pattern of cumulative disruption that no single weapon could claim alone. Magnetic mines laid from the air, Limpet operations at sea, and commando raids in occupied ports together denied the Axis thousands of ship days of service. It was warfare measured in hours and hulls withheld from use, a campaign of delay. By the final years of the conflict, German naval logistics were visibly frayed. The destruction of dry docks at Saint-Nazaire in 1942, the repeated damage to merchant ships at Bordeaux and Trondheim, and the continuing repair backlog in Baltic yards all drew resources from the U-boat arm. Salvage crews who might have cleared mines were now repairing crippled freighters. Steel plate that might have reinforced new submarines was diverted to patch old ones. The weapons behind that attrition had been made in small workshops with names few civilians ever knew: Whitchurch, Aylesbury, Fort William. Their products, Toyshop inventions, multiplied unseen effects across a continent. In the Navy's ledgers, the device appeared under the prosaic heading of underwater charges, magnetic. Reports from combined operations and the SOE described it in human terms. Agents recalled the feel of its weight, the stubborn grip of its magnets, the muted click as it bit against steel. For them, it was less a piece of equipment than a companion in peril, reliable, compact, and final. Its silence was both its virtue and its danger. Once armed, it could not be disarmed safely. Losses were acknowledged with restraint. The small team nature of Limpet operations meant that casualties were intimate and conspicuous. The disappearance of a canoe, the failure of a return signal, the empty space at breakfast in a training hut. Post-war, a handful of decorations, DSOs, DSCs, MCs, were awarded often posthumously to men whose names survived only in debriefs and logbooks. The balance sheet was brutal. For each successful attack, lives were gambled and often lost in silence. Yet the effect of those sacrifices was visible far beyond the harbors they targeted. German shipping statistics show a persistent shortfall between theoretical capacity and actual tonnage moved after 1942. Naval historians attribute part of this to the cumulative effects of magnetic and Limpet sabotage, a small but significant percentage that stretched enemy supply lines and reduced flexibility in coastal traffic. The British method of incremental denial, subtle, statistical, and relentless, had worked. At home, the work of the toy shop continued. Even as the European war neared its close, MD1's workshops at Whitchurch produced improved versions of the Limpet and the smaller clam charged for use in Asia. Trials at the Royal Engineers establishment confirmed that a trained swimmer could attach one in seconds. The technology had become routine. What once seemed fantastical was now an item of standard issue. When peace came, the public knew little of this story. Censorship and classification protected the details, and those who had served in secret seldom spoke of it. The device itself, now rendered obsolete by newer explosives, was quietly shelved. But its influence persisted. In the years that followed, naval architects incorporated counter-sabotage design features into new ship classes. Port authorities installed underwater inspection regimes and magnetic anomaly detectors, direct descendants of the fear the Limpet had instilled. Even in the calm of peacetime, engineers studying underwater construction recognized the dual legacy of the invention. It had shown how magnetism could be used both to destroy and to preserve, a reminder that scientific insight, once uncovered, can serve any end. The war had been won, but the reckoning of its hidden weapons was only beginning. The next chapter belonged to the official reports, the trials, and the quiet commendations that tried to measure what this small invention had achieved, and at what cost. When the guns fell silent, Britain's secret war laboratories faced a quieter reckoning. The devices born in haste and secrecy were now examined under the cool light of peace. At the War Office, a committee convened under the Awards to Inventors scheme, the mechanism by which the Crown recognized civilian contributors whose inventions had served national defense. Among the files lay the unassuming designation Magnetic Limpet Mine. Its creators, Major Millis Jefferis and engineer Stuart Macrae, received modest compensation, noted without fanfare in the records at Kew. The citation acknowledged the weapon's exceptional utility in clandestine naval operations. No mention was made of how many ships it had helped to sink. Such details remained classified for decades. For the men of MD1, the closure was both satisfying and melancholy. Their wartime workshops, once humming with prototypes and risk, were wound down by 1945. The benches were cleared, the drawings filed, and the remaining stockpiles of explosives dismantled. Britain no longer needed clandestine charges. Yet the expertise endured. Many of those same engineers went on to contribute to post-war ordnance research, the demagnetization of ships, harbor defense systems, and underwater engineering. The moral questions lingered longer. Some of the SOE veterans who had placed limpets beneath hulls found it difficult to speak of their missions. Others regarded the device with quiet pride. It had done its work without cruelty or spectacle. It struck at machines, not at civilians. Within the ethics of total war, that distinction mattered deeply. The academic and technical communities studied the limpet with fascination. Naval architects learned from its failures as much as its successes. It demonstrated how small quantities of explosive energy, correctly positioned, could create catastrophic structural failure in ships. A lesson that would influence peacetime engineering as well as post-war demolition and salvage techniques. In a curious inversion, the weapon designed for destruction became a model for controlled underwater construction. At the Imperial War Museum, curators began collecting examples of these devices for public education. One of the surviving specimens, its paint flaking, its magnets dulled with rust, sits today in a display case beside a Royal Navy diver's kit. Visitors often pass it by without realizing its significance. There are no ornate plaques, no cinematic footage to dramatize its use. Yet in that small steel bowl lies the distilled spirit of British wartime invention. Pragmatic, austere, and devastatingly effective. The statistical legacy was compiled quietly. Post-war analyses by the Admiralty concluded that magnetic and limpet sabotage had directly or indirectly contributed to the loss or disablement of dozens of Axis vessels. Some were sunk outright. Others never returned to service. The cumulative effect, while small compared with the great sea battles, was strategically disproportionate. For every ship lost, others were delayed, inspected, or held back in harbor under fear of sabotage. The limpet had turned paranoia into a weapon. For Britain, the lessons of that device went beyond engineering. It reaffirmed a national talent for practical invention, for meeting superior force with superior thought. The same ingenuity that had produced radar and code breaking had, in a shed in Bedford, produced a weapon that changed how wars at sea could be fought. By 1946, the official histories had moved on to jets, rockets, and atomic power. The magnetic mine, once at the center of Britain's peril and ingenuity, became a footnote. Yet in the narrow archives of Whitchurch and Farnham, in penciled notes still smudged with oil, one can trace the patient work that underpinned an empire's survival. In that sense, the limpet's aftermath was not an ending but a continuation, its spirit absorbed into the quiet competence of a nation rebuilding from ruin, carrying forward the conviction that small, precise ideas can shift the course of great events. History, like the tide, never entirely recedes. Beneath its calm surface, the marks of what Britain built, and what it dared, remain faintly visible in the metal and magnetism of its past. In the long quiet after victory, the story of the Limpet mine feels almost implausible, a weapon born from magnets and intuition that changed the rhythm of a global war. It speaks not of glory or spectacle, but of patience, intellect, and resolve. The virtues that have always defined Britain at its best. In the workshops of Bedford and Whitchurch, ordinary men found extraordinary ways to serve. They worked not for recognition but from conviction, that science properly applied could defend a civilization. Their invention did not roar through the skies or thunder across battlefields. It worked in silence underwater unseen, and in that silence lay its power. Each steel bowl pressed against a hull carried within it a fragment of Britain's wartime spirit. Quiet courage, practical ingenuity, and an unspoken faith that even in darkness, human wit could outmatch brute strength. The men who carried them, commandos, divers, agents, did so knowing that few would ever hear their names. Yet their work shortened voyages, saved ships, and eroded the confidence of an empire that had once seemed invincible. The Limpet's legacy is not only mechanical, it is moral. It showed that victory can be built from precision rather than destruction, from discipline rather than fury. It reminded the world that intelligence, when guided by conscience, is the truest weapon of defense. Today, the surviving examples rest in glass cases, small and rusted, almost humble. Yet they tell a larger story, of a nation that met tyranny not only with armies and aircraft but with ideas, of a people who turned curiosity into courage and science into survival. In the quiet hum of a museum, a visitor might lean closer and read the placard, Limpet Mine, 1940-45 British invention. It is a modest label for what it represents. The moment when a crazy magnet trick, born in a cold workshop, helped turn the tide of war beneath the surface of the sea.